Hello everybody, how many people are there in this course? 209?
75.
Hello all 75 of you. Sorry about the weird setup here, I have to walk in front of my slides and back off again. I've been asked to talk to you about the three words you see on the screen: science, risk and controversy. I'm going to take a particular angle on controversy, which is going to focus a lot on advocacy, activism and particularly public intellectualism because we're all scholars here. So to begin though, I want to do what I do with any kind of SciComm talk. I think before you talk about doing anything in SciComm, you need to think about these three things. So goals, assumptions, and context. If you're not clear on those, if you're not articulate on those, everything else you do is kind of messy and pointless. So first up, goals. What do you want to do should be clear in your head. The way it looks, what it's going to achieve, etc. But even more importantly with goals often is making sure what you want to do or what you plan to do, your action aligns with the things you're trying to achieve. Often, this sounds obvious, but often it's not the case. People decide on a course of action, but they haven't decided on what that action will actually achieve in the context of the goals. And a classic example for me is climate change or climate scientists who will say to you, what people need to do is learn more climate science. And what they really mean is what people need to do is act in accordance with what the climate science is telling us. They're not the same thing, and it's a classic deficit model mistake. You know about the deficit model, I'm assuming, and if not, you will soon. Assumptions. This one's a big one. We all make them. We can't help it. We're normal human beings about it. But the best way to help address your assumptions or counter for them is to articulate them out loud. Consider the assumptions you're making about audiences, etc. And the quick shorthand, the first question I'll ask, and the biggest one I think is, are you offering people a solution to a problem they don't have? And often we do. We offer to solve a problem that people don't believe they actually have. And in the case of face masks and COVID, that's become quite apparent. When you tell people face masks will protect them from a disease, but there are people who don't believe in the disease, you're offering them a solution, a face mask to a problem, the disease they don't believe exists. Most importantly, or the easiest way though for you to check for your assumptions, I think, is to ask these questions or be on the lookout for when you use language like this. People need to know what you must understand. The important thing is, the moment you're making articulations like that, what you're doing is pointing implicitly to assumptions that you're making about what's important. Finally, context. Almost nothing makes sense without context. I'd argue almost, in fact, possibly no SciComm makes sense without context or any communication. So you can read those, I assume. You choose to decide what context is important to you, but make sure you ask yourselves and other people, what are the context critical factors? So those are my party political broadcasts before getting onto the topic I'm actually supposed to speak about. First up, stories. Now, there are whole careers devoted to telling stories. Will does nice long lectures and workshops on them. So do I. So you're going to get about 10 minutes worth from us. First up, every culture has stories and historic, cultural, significant, important, socially relevant stories. They're everywhere. We love them. We remember them. They stick in our heads. They entice us back. We love them. We value them very highly. They become entrenched in our assertions of meaning and our beliefs about ourselves. And how we convey what it is to be the kinds of people we are often comes through stories. So if you think about what you like, were you in the room, I would ask you to do this live. What are your favourite stories, movies, podcasts, tales, nursery rhymes, whatever they may be? What are your favourite stories? What is it you like about them? Why do you think you like them? Obviously, these are all my favourites. I'm a big fan of Sex and the City and the Holy Bible. There's always a Holy Bible and a Sex and the City book by my bedside table. Now I'm going to offer you some videos. I'm not going to show them in this lecture. This video you may have been exposed to or at least pointed to in other courses or indeed other lectures. If you haven't already, I recommend go and have a look at this. The interesting thing about this is using scientific substrates to decide or to discuss what effects certain types of storytelling have on people. It's about 17 minutes long, so of course I'm not going to play it, but you can see the link there for your viewing pleasure. Go check it out. Now, something I think I need to make clear, because I have this problem often in first year courses in particular, people believe if you say storytelling, you mean fiction. That's not the case. Storytelling is not synonymous with fiction. What it is about is narrative and story structure, narrative structure. Fiction does not come into it. It can, but it's not critical. So if you look at stories like this also, we tell the same stories, we use the same structures over and over again. So that would mean in principle that all these things are in some sense equivalent. Maybe they are. Elements of them probably are, but we tell the same stories repeatedly. We just change the characters, the context, etc. This is a complex version of how you might do this. This is what's called, I think, the monomyth. A guy called Joseph Campbell. Joseph? I think it's Joseph. He's come up with this. He's looked at old school stories from many ancient and recent cultures, and he's basically tracked this path, this structure to them. I don't expect you to remember it. I don't expect you to necessarily use it, but it is an example of how stories can have a very clear structure that is, if you look deeply enough, often repeated around the world. If you want to see a bit more on that, there's a nice little video again. Let's pretend it's running. Are you back? Okay. Here's a really simple one. This is the most simple I've seen. It's called the Dobzhansky template. And basically it says, nothing in the light of blah or nothing in X makes sense except in the light of Y. What does that mean? The example I'll use, which I stole from a buddy of mine, Randy Olson, is this. Make America great again. So Trump, I could get into party politics, but I won't. I'm not a Trump guy. But one thing he did very well was this slogan. This slogan motivated people and it made sense to people. And what he's essentially saying is, nothing in America today, when he was campaigning, makes sense except in the light of greatness. So greatness was the key. So imagine doing that yourself. It's not always easy, but imagine doing it with something like this. Nothing in the light of climate change, nothing in climate change makes sense except in the light of, what would the word be? Action, disaster, something. Is there a simple, clear line to help you tell the most basic premise of your story using that template? As I say, it's not always easy, but it helps focus your thinking. So what about, that was probably nicely gurgly in the microphone there. Delicious. Very nice water. What about science and stories? So IMRAD is one shorthand for introduction, method, results, discussion. You might call it aim, method, results, conclusion. We all know the pattern. We're doing science or psychom here. Is it a story? In a sense it is. It certainly does a why, a how, what do we find, what does it mean? There's a story and a narrative structure to it. So science already tells stories. I've answered my own question. If you want to make them more dramatic though, here's another short video which you can go and find on your own. Link is there. The formula for turning your data into a dramatic story. This is an interesting example. It's not the only example out there, but it's to help you take something that's traditionally more dry and bland and beef it up a bit. Here's a simpler story format though. We don't need the 17 steps of Joseph Campbell. We don't need necessarily to go Dobzhansky, which can get a bit confusing. But you look at this one, you'd all recognize it. A story sets up, there's a situation, things are ticking along, then there's a complication, and then we go through the complication, we address it, and finally there's a resolution. Arguably science papers tell that story too, not necessarily completely engagingly. Even simpler is one that you'll get sick of hearing about from at least me and Will Grant, which is and but therefore. This one is about as simple as it gets, and if you keep that in the back of your mind, you'll always be able to keep a story alive, or at least see it. And the bottom line with that is a story begins when something happens. So what does that mean? Story begins at the but. So whenever you're telling a bland list of facts, this and then this and then this happens, look for a but, look for a change, look for a conflict, a left turn, whatever it may be. Look for the but. Strong narrative structure has been mimicked like this. The ABT has appeared throughout history, arguably. And here are two examples, again, taken from Randy Olson's book, which I think are great, just to demonstrate how strong narrative structure can be in strange places it can be found. Here we have a story I'm sure you're all familiar with. This is me pausing to let you read it. There's our setup, there's our situation. We go to the but. It was against the rules to take the lamb to school. Therefore, the children laughed and played to see a lamb at school. Part of the reason it's been argued that these things are so resilient, other than for the cuteness of it all, is the structure is extremely straightforward, extremely recognizable, and we like it. One more. This also is probably familiar to you, at least if you come from an English-speaking background originally. Rockabye Baby. So here's the premise, here's the setup, the situation, but then the cradle breaks, there's the twist, therefore down will come baby, cradle and all. I don't know why nursery rhymes are always so horrific, but they frequently are. One of our cameramen is about to have a child. I'm sure he's pondering nursery rhymes quite a lot right now. A great little video I'd like to commend to you is this is Kurt Vonnegut. It's an old, grainy, crappy video, but it's hilarious. And he demonstrates that even this premise of and but therefore, conflict resolution and so forth, doesn't necessarily have to follow that obvious pattern. I really recommend watching this. It's quite funny. It's very dry and tongue-in-cheek. He's a master storyteller, and this is well worth a look. So basically, remember though, storytaking tells practice. Storytelling takes practice. You're not necessarily born with a natural ability, particularly if you're bringing subject matter to it you're not familiar with. So the models that I've shown you very quickly, those are there's some ways to think about it. And I think if nothing else, what you want to focus on is the idea of narrative structure. When you're trying to tell a tale, do you have some structure to it at all? At the very least though, focus on the buts. And there's a bunch of things. Obviously I expected to write them down. I'll flick quickly through them and you'll never be able to see them again. These slides will also be made available. Yeah, okay. So there you go. That's storytelling in 5 seconds. You're now all experts. Next part of this short yak is risk. If you're wondering why I'm hammering through all these 3 things in this short piece, it's because I cover most of these things in courses and research and other things that I do. So we thought bang them together. So, first up, I hope this translates to screen. How does that look on screen? Is it doing the terrible things that it should be? If not, if we upload the slides, people can look at it. So otherwise, look it up on the internet. It's not like this is an uncommon optical illusion. So basically, have a look at that. What color are the dots? It's a different question to what color do the dots appear to be, but what color are they? Simple answer really is, it depends. Depends how you're looking, depends whether you're looking directly at them, on the side, etc. What about though, what would other people say? What color would other people say those dots are? How would you even ask that question clearly? This to me is a perfect visual metaphor for how people interpret risk, or the difficulties that we come up with when we speak about risk without qualifying and clarifying our terms, what we mean, what we prioritize, indeed goals, assumptions, and context. So context matters hugely. In fact, often it matters more than the facts and the science and the things you're going to reveal. So I'll tell you a quick story. I used to work a lot with UNESCO in the Pacific region in the early part of the 21st century. Sounds so sci-fi, I love that. And a lot of the work I did was coming out of Samoa. And one of the things that would happen a lot was people were concerned about the extent to which obesity, heart disease, etc. were a problem in that country. Samoans are some of the biggest people in the world. Pound for pound, they have an issue with obesity. And also what they do is, which is not a bad thing, whenever there's the opening of a building, a practice, a habit, or something that's going on, a ritual, heaps of food is involved. The tables must be groaning with food, otherwise it's not a proper celebration. So one day, a nutritionist advisor was working with UNESCO. They were opening up a school in Samoa, and the table was groaning with food, as you'd expect. And one of the main features of the table was giant cans of Spam. This is this cured meat you see here. Originally, I think American armed forces came up with this thing. The meat lasts forever. It's very, very nutritional, or at least energy dense, and it lasts forever in hot weather. So it makes sense. It's really good for you in terms of keeping your calories up. But so they sell it in giant cans, or they used to, 5 kilo cans of Spam. So this table was covered in these cans of Spam. The dietitian was talking to some locals and she said, look, guys, you've got a problem with obesity, you've got a problem with high blood sugars, you've got a problem with cancers and other related diabetes, etc., etc. Why in the hell are you putting this stuff on your tables? Why in the hell are you using this? It's terrible for you. And the response from these people was, do you want us to give up our traditional foods? She was, of course, dumbfounded by this, because what they were trying to say was, we've literally been doing this for a few generations now. This food is important to us. For some, it's become a part of their, I use this term broadly, culture. This dumbfounded the dietitian because, of course, to her, it's clearly introduced. It clearly wasn't local, wasn't native to the country. But the point was for them, if you gave up Spam, you were in a sense risking a connection to culture, to the past, but also to quite practical concerns like keeping food palatable or indeed not poisonous in situations where you don't have refrigeration. So what constituted the real risk was not necessarily what the dietitian thought. So what if then, instead of going with some messy issues of culture, we go into straightforward, straight up, simple data? Here's one. Here's a table from the Australian government. It represents the likelihood of Down syndrome by number of births depending on the age of the mother. So as I say, this is official stats. They're about 15, 16 years old now, so maybe the numbers have shifted slightly, but the gist is here. Now, I use this, and I have used this for a long time, and I ask people in a room, tell me what the riskiest category is. And never has this failed, literally ever, including practicing scientists in government, etc. People will always say, that's the category, that is the riskiest category. And it's pretty clear why. Because you get the most number of births, or the most number of Down syndrome per number of births. But of course, this is from the perspective of each individual birth, or the perspective of the age of the mother. I could also make an argument to say that's the riskiest category, because in absolute terms, far more children are born to women within that age group. Therefore, in absolute terms, you get many more babies born with Downs in this subcategory. If you're taking a whole of government view, a societal view, the risk is very different. This is basic, straightforward stats. They're not contested other than maybe some nuances on the numbers over here, but in the end, it comes down entirely to your perspective and the position you're taking on the issue. So bottom line is risk looks like this. Technically, this is what risk looks like. The risk of a thing is the probability of it happening times the consequences of that happening. This could be actually, this simplicity masks potentially very complicated equations. However, that's the bottom line. That's the technical gist of an equation. Now, if you want to get more complicated, ironically, you can go social. Risk, according to people much older and cleverer than me, equals hazard plus outrage. So it's the impression of the thing, the problem, the bad stuff, added to that is the outrage, the horror, the fear, the despair that people may experience should it occur. It may have nothing to do with the technical reality of that risk occurring to them, nor the reality of how bad it could appear. These are two very different equations for risk. But if people just use the term risk without describing their terms and being clear in which type they're talking about, you can come up with very different conclusions. And my favorite version of this now is the modernized version, which is risk equals oh my God times what the fuck. I think that's the most easily remembered one in terms of realities of communication with normal human beings. So I'm just closing on the risk bit before I zip into controversy. So these are two of my favorite comments or sentiments. So from an expert point of view, you should listen to us, we know what's actually going on. And we're seeing this a lot in the situation with COVID, where there are certain experts who are dumbfounded, confused and horrified that people won't just listen to the science. This is a reasonable position to take. They technically have the expertise about the disease so far and the problems it causes. It's an understandable frustration that experts may have. However, it's not always right. They have a particular branch of expertise or a particular area of expertise that might not work in all contexts. Go back to hazard and outrage. The other one is, from we poor humans' point of view, if only they would tell us the real risks. Why won't they just tell us what to do? Should we or should we not wear a mask? Do we need to social distance? Can my kids go to school or not? These are very reasonable questions to ask in times of uncertainty and danger. However, the ability to answer them is not straightforward. So these are the kinds of environments we're dealing with risk. Finally, two of my favorite things. Biggest mistakes made when people are trying to convince you to accept the risk. One is, do something that's going to inconvenience you, cost you, embarrass you today so that nothing else happens, and I'm going to offer you no new benefits that are palpable to you. Wear a mask today so that you don't get sick. Promising something won't happen to someone is not a strong incentive for certain people. So you can see why people who are, let's call it skeptical about the disease at all, when you tell them to add an inconvenience to their lives, the more extreme view can get very upset about this because you're offering them no benefit they believe in. Finally, the other one is, and that's our favorite classic deficit model, focusing on technical arguments to convince people. This is one of the classic glitches of technical people speaking to non-technical people. Technical arguments are rarely as persuasive to anyone else other than us on the inside. Last bit. Wait, 2 hours yet? So let's weave it all together. Controversy. Very common where there's risk at play. Very common. It's great for stories. If you want to tell an interesting story, you need some controversy, some sparks, some fire. You need a big butt. So how do we handle it in SciComm? What's the right way for us to handle it? There are many ways to look at this. The kinds of issues I'm talking about, particularly now, usually and in the past, I would only use climate change as an example, or climate catastrophe. Now, of course, we can add delights like the coronavirus problems. So how do you handle stuff like this? How do you handle the controversy and the brawling over it? What's the role of a SciComm person? So the right thing depends what you're trying to achieve. Back to goals, context, assumptions. And also, I would argue, and have argued, and have gotten some people sad with me and some people glad. What are you prepared to do to achieve the goals you have, particularly in the context of controversy? Because as a rule, if you're communicating risk and there's something going wrong, your goal, without doubt, is to change people in some way. You want them to do something. You want them to do something that you're advising them to do. And in order to achieve that, you may have to sacrifice other things. So I see it all through the lens of advocacy, public intellectualism, and so forth. Public intellectualism sounds like a fairly wanky term, I get that, but I'm an academic, that's part of our job. But in addition to that, this is one of the ways we can reach out beyond our own corridors, our own offices and so forth. But a lot of people who aren't academics do it as well. So I'm going to throw a few words at you. The references to this are down the bottom, so you can always read the whole thing yourself if you would like. To begin with, so someone who's a public intellectual, indeed an advocate, potentially an activist, they visibly represent a standpoint. So if you want to stand up within the context of a controversy and communicate useful stuff, visibly representing a standpoint is kind of crucial to that. If you're not representing something, you're just someone yelling at people. Psychom people now, particularly I'm talking from the academic point of view, but in general, are becoming more and more agents of change, or at least of trying to affect political and policy change. So in order to do that, we can't just translate anymore. Psychom started in the translation context or the translation tradition, but now we've moved a long way beyond that, And this links intimately to storytelling. If you really want to reach people, engage with people, affect change, etc., storytelling is a critical way of doing this. So the three do interweave in this topic. Now, these are the things I find interesting. John Stewart's a guy I have a lot of time for. I think he's very intelligent and very clever. And if you look at that quote, I'll pause. So it's been argued not only by that author but others that people like John Stewart, and indeed many comedians, are becoming the new public intellectuals, agents for change with strong evidence bases and abilities to engage people. Moving forward, there's this example from 2009. So a magazine called Foreign Policy, which I of course have never read, asked people who are the top 20 public intellectuals. They gave them a list, and they gave people the opportunity to write in their own. Classic American voting, you can write in your own candidate. And overwhelmingly, they selected Stephen Colbert as the new and the most standout public intellectual. If you don't know who he is, get online now. Pause this lecture, stop wasting your time, go and look at Stephen Colbert. These people represent public intellectualism, advocates, etc., in ways that academia and science people often will not, but can. So what we're arguing here, or what I argue, is that the job is to challenge, disrupt, and reconfigure. Based on evidence, based on your belief, based on clear assumptions, social conscience, whatever you will, but in these spaces of controversy, this is what it's for. So comedy in particular, I would argue, is extremely useful for this. It's also more fun. And I'll let you read that quote yourselves. But you'll see key words here: subversive, incisive, but also informed critiques. And I argue strongly this is a role for science communication. And if you haven't seen this, I suggest you do, as an example of both psychom and advocacy and controversy. John Oliver showing us what 97 climate scientists versus 3 deniers actually looks like in a room. It's a great clip if you haven't seen it, and it's worth having a look at. Go for it. This one in some ways is even better. John Oliver co-opted Bill Nye the Science Guy into a very frank and adult version of the problem with climate change or climate change behaviour. Again, if you haven't seen it, go for it. You may not agree. Warning, contains potty words. So, arguably in the context of controversy, in the context of helping people understand and work with risk, and also in telling stories that are engaging, we want to challenge the status quo and orient ourselves towards action if we're talking about advocacy, if we're talking about public intellectualism. So we have to walk a fine line though, because it can be awkward, it can be uncomfortable, and in fact it arguably should be. Basically, I'm arguing, and I'm not the first, we should be disruptors, intelligent, modified, or not modified, informed critiquers and disruptors. Just a couple of quotes from old people again. So and it's his because it's old school, old day writing. But the bottom line here for this guy, for Ralph Waldo Emerson, inaction is cowardice. And I would argue again for psychom people in these current times with climate and COVID, etc., inaction is cowardice. There's shit that's got to be done. That could just be stimulating debate. Now, this is an assertion I made myself. I think we have to walk a fine line between unvarnished truths and inciting hysteria. We've got to be careful about creating carnage and destruction. That's not our only goal. But you've got to push it right to the edge if you want to engage in controversy. So communicate ideas that disrupt, but don't necessarily destroy. That's not always easy to tell, and you may screw it up. As I mentioned before, discomfort is part of it. If you're feeling too comfortable, maybe you're not doing enough. Finally, it's not just me telling you this, even eggheads in scholarly journals say it. So this is from Nature in 2017. So there's an editorial concerned about the incoming administration, aka Trump, aka, oh my God. So this is probably ringing more true than it ever did. This is what they're doing. They're calling on scientists to be more engaged in public debates, step beyond their own disciplines, change mindsets, and in fact, going on to say this. This is a new situation. Science did not encourage this until very recently. The idea that nature would encourage that. Move beyond your expertise. Move beyond your peers. Get out into the world. You guys are part of quite an early phase of this stuff going on. So I encourage you to get deeply involved. Deeply involved. If you've got a position or a thing that's burning you that you think is a problem, climate, COVID, etc. But finally, in the end, regardless of what you want to do, I'll bring you back to these 3 points. Your goals, the notion of context, and challenging your assumptions. So that's my whirlwind on, what did I talk about? Risk, controversy, and the other thing. Stories. Thanks, gang.
Okay, that's awesome. Look at me weirdly again like that. That's great.
I didn't expect the voice projection.
I get it. I feel like I have to start with projection, otherwise you're not really talking.
I'm not at the back of the class.
There is so much in there that I want to pull apart.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna go and the students, and it's probably all of you actually, who did the web class recently, are going to guess what my question is.
What's my favourite colour?
No, not what's your favourite colour. What is your favourite colour? You can't commit. There you go. No, you gave us a bunch of awesome definitions or ways of approaching storytelling. What is the one that most viscerally resonates with you? So not how, if you're on the spot, I got to give a structural definition. You can do that if you want. But what is the thing when you are about to storytell or thinking of storytelling or planning or whatever it is, what are the things that you're thinking about when you're trying to find or define a story?
I always look for the shock, the surprise. Always. That's my first. I've got to be vaguely interested in the subject area.
Yeah.
But then I want to look for where are the left turns, the right turns, or the whoa, I didn't expect that, or it could be it makes me angry, makes me happy, but something that. The but, I do look for the but of something. And
so, but this is a but that goes against your own existing knowledge. So it's like your own knowledge actually makes a difference there, that you're saying?
Maybe knowledge, or knowledge, perspective, interest. It's just something that makes me go, huh? Like unexpected. And the unexpected may be informational, but it could be emotional, for example. It could be perspective, just like the mask argument. Like in that chat, when I was saying, the people who don't see a benefit in wearing a mask, and they genuinely don't. Therefore, saying to them, if you wear this mask, you can get a benefit you don't believe in or don't think you need. I remember my first response to that was, all right, I get it. I get it. Okay. I don't like it, but it provoked a reaction in me. And the fact that I didn't like it made me think about it harder. And that's the kind of thing I look for in a story that does that to me. Usually I look for funny though, but if I can.
No, I get it. I get it. And so what I'm trying to explore here is, people often think about storytelling or story crafting very much as, tell a story from, here's a standard structure, and if you repeat these things, it'll happen, bang, bang, bang. But a lot of the work that we do in the world of science communication is searching to find that story. And I guess there's a couple of things that I'm trying to explore there is, how do you know when you've found a story? And then how do you know how to turn that shock or that moment of surprise into that story?
There has to be, it's tough to codify, isn't it? Practice. I mean, we know this, but you got to go beyond just codifying it as simply as that. If you've got a but you've got no resolution, if it's just like you blow everything up and walk away, that's not a satisfying end. Mm-hmm. We don't like that unless there's going to be a part 2.
Yeah.
So I think part of looking at that is, okay, here's the boom or the weird or the wow, but how do I then bring it back together so we can all feel happy and somehow expanded at the end of it? So does the story have an arc to it? Does it have an ending in some sense? But the ending could be emotional closure. It could be factual.
Yeah.
It could be temporal. I mean, there's so many ways that it could roll. Does that make sense? But I mean, often now, honestly, this is terrible having just offered structures, and I'm sure you've offered many structures. It's a bit,
very similar
It's
ones.
a bit gut.
Yeah.
You kind of know. And I think actually most people do know. You can kind of tell, if you can hear it a bit as if it's outside your own head, you kind of go, it's not done
So
yet.
this is the thing. And you referenced Randy Olson up there when you're giving the talk, that he gave, and others have given, those structural definitions of the story. Context, problem resolution, or and, but, therefore, or the hero's journey, or all sorts of things that you can define there.
Yeah.
But when it actually comes down to it, a whole chunk of it is still visceral. Like it still happens in another part of your body. I mean, it's not quite still. Obviously.
It's as if models only represent reality; they're not actually reality.
Well, there you go. But it really is that we can use those models to help understand what's going on. Absolutely, I think those structures do.
Yeah, for sure.
But that we still have to have that sort of visceral response to storytelling. And
well, you've seen it. You see stories where they've clearly followed the structure, and you kind of go, I still don't care.
No, not at all.
Because I can see the structure, but I can't see the stuff around it. I'm so blinded by them obviously following a formula.
Yep.
Like a crappy movie, a crappy TV show, I reckon one of the key things about it is you can see they're following the formula. It's really obvious.
Yep.
They haven't dressed it up enough.
Yeah.
So the formula's not enough.
How do you get to the visceral then? How do you become someone that gets that visceral telling of stories?
This is all anecdotal, but practice. If nothing else, just practice and be prepared to put it in front of an audience so you actually get feedback.
Yeah.
Like practicing in your own head, great, but that's not feedback.
I think something really interesting there is that one of the key aspects of storytelling is that a story, you can write down, you can define, but storytelling has to have audience. And I know we go back to Psychon 101, audience and goals, if they're our 101 things, absolutely. But we can go further into audience in terms of, we can understand who they are. But storytelling doesn't happen until you've pushed that story into their brain.
Yeah, telling involves a tellee.
Yeah, absolutely.
At some level, yeah.
And there's something in there about making them viscerally feel those emotions.
It's the only way you know. I mean, like when we've done live shows compared to recording in a room, the difference when you have an audience live in front of you, and you know then sometimes you're surprised there's a reaction to something that you wouldn't have expected.
Yeah.
And so if you'd only been doing it theoretically, you would never have picked that as an audience point, and uplifting, engaging, shocking, whatever it is. I mean, that's a very literal example of what you're saying, actually having people right there responding to you, as opposed to now where we're talking to each other. Don't feel left alone. We do know you're out there, but you need audience.
What do you think? Do you think scientists are ready for that visceral end of storytelling?
I think they're getting there. I think it's improving because it's showing itself to work, or at the very least, some of the old boring ways are showing themselves not to.
Yeah.
Because we know it, and I mean, COVID's been wonderful for this. I mean, demonstrating the visceral thing, like the Fauci being made to look sexy in the US and so forth, and Trump wailing that people will like Fauci more than him. It must be his personality. It's like all the way it's been dressed up, but they're going more visceral. They're going for the balls rather than the brain, so to speak. That's quoting intellectual people.
Technical term there.
But you know what I mean? Like they're going for the groin as well as the brain and the heart. So I think it's starting to demonstrate that it has some value. So I think scientists, if they're not ready yet, they're getting more ready because they're seeing value.
This is the thing I keep thinking about storytelling is that if and as you were saying before, if we go too structural with a too structural definition, but then ignore the fact that one of the key things about storytelling is attempting to engage with people's emotions, or attempting to make them empathize with someone else, someone distant to them. And that might happen through the telling of an emotion that is a story, but it's not necessarily that and, but, therefore structure or something.
Yeah, it's the straight visceral. Like I know when if I'm telling a story that I've told 1,000 times. Sometimes it's way more interesting than others.
Yep.
It's nothing to do with the facts.
Yeah.
It's how involved I am, whether I'm distracted, etc. And you can see it again if you've got an audience. There are times I've told that Samoan story that I spoke about earlier, and people are kind of going, "No, that's fine." But it's weird telling it to a camera and not to a group, because watching people's faces change when you say to them, people called spam their traditional foods.
Yeah.
I look around the audience to watch the shock, and that gives me more energy, gives them more energy, etc. But then look at the video I put up about Kurt Vonnegut. If you want going against formulae, the little story arcs that he demonstrates are really not necessarily following and but therefores at all.
I haven't seen that one. But
It's hilarious too. He's got this dry, slow deliveries. He's got a blackboard, piece of chalk. And if you looked at the structure without knowing the stories, he never says what the story is, but he refers to a famous, I suppose, fairy tale. And you just start smirking and giggling immediately, because the moment he starts telling the structure of it, you go, I know what that story is, that's very funny. Doesn't follow situation, conflict resolution clearly at all necessarily. And some of them start horribly and stay horrible. But the way he delivers it and the way he talks about it, you kind of start grinning and going, good point.
There's something really interesting there in terms of that feeling what it is straight away. You know that J.D. Phillips, The Magical Art of Storytelling. Magical Science of Storytelling. I actually used that just this morning in my class. And I actually referred to it. Someone was asking what something is. So 3 times today.
Yeah.
3 times today that's come up.
It's everywhere.
I would commend it enormously. I think there's enormous aspects that are really worth doing.
It's clever.
But one of the things that I really wanted to draw on there is midway through, he's telling lots of different stories in there. And midway through, he starts telling a sad story. And I've seen it a few times. And he comes to sit down in his chair, and you can feel the emotion instantly.
Yep.
Like the starting of the storytelling is him getting into that emotion, and then getting his crowd into that emotion. I've got a room full of people watching the video, and you can feel that emotion hit straight away. And I told a story not long after that doesn't hit the same emotions, hits similar sorts of emotions, and you can feel it straight from the start. And I feel like there's something in storytelling that is, I'm going to expose this emotion as clearly as I possibly can to you, and get it into your head.
I think it links to this this ephemeral quality of authenticity. The same person, the different people telling the same story will have profoundly different effect,
Of course.
depending on how natural they feel about it, how involved they are themselves.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the thing you're asking about, whether scientists are ready. Scientists have had the idea of beating emotion out of what they tell people. They've had it beaten into them for years.
Yeah.
Take the emotion out, take the subjectivity out, blah, 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 blah. And that, to my mind, is the exact antithesis of good storytelling. And I'm not blaming science or scientists for it. That's the tradition, that's how it's run, and that's what gave it its strength for a while. But that's part of the issue. If you can't deliver it with any kind of heart and soul yourself, a great story could be a crap one, really quickly. Even if it's got the elements.
Yeah.
So that's part of it. Like, you've got to own it a little bit, which makes you more vulnerable.
See, that's one of the big things. I do wonder, in terms of scientists resisting storytelling, you can see when it's successful, then their peers are going to say, "You manipulated me. That's bullshit. Get out of here." When it's unsuccessful, they'll say, "Well, it doesn't work." So you're kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't.
Yeah, aren't you just manipulating people? Yes. If I deliver something I want to persuade people to do, but if I deliver it in a bland way, it's honest. If I deliver a persuasion in an emotive way, it's dishonest.
What's the best argument against that? What's the best argument for
what effect do you want? That's my basic. What are you trying to achieve? It's the climate thing again. If you want people to change their behaviour because climate's getting trashed and your evidence shows it, try and focus on that end goal and work backwards. Of course, that could mean horrible, manipulative, evil behaviour. It doesn't have to be. And we've been abused, both of us individually and together, for suggesting such things. But what's your goal?
So does the end justify the means?
Absolutely, 100% in every case. No, but it shouldn't be black and white. I mean, it shouldn't be black and white. I think you should be prepared to make sacrifices in sciences or whatever to the true old tradition of truth and blah, blah, blah. I'm not saying lie, I'm not saying mislead, but I am saying emphasize things that are going to lead to behaviours or changes that you know to be positive based on the evidence that you have. Because if you don't want to do that, that's fine, but then you're not going to get the results you're after.
Yeah.
So that's your trade-off. What are you prepared to do? I mean, I said that really early in my blurb. What are you prepared to trade off to get where you want to go? It shouldn't be a trade-off, but I think it's often portrayed that way. So we're the people, the charlatans selling the snake oil, because we say, hey, communicate, work with emotions. And they're like, you want us to manipulate? It's like, no, but I do want you to persuade.
Yes and no.
Yeah, exactly. I do and I don't. What do you want?
See, that's a tough one. And it comes to the stuff you're saying there in public intellectualism.
Yeah.
That I was thinking this before, that the motto of the university here is first serve the truth. And
I thought it was everyone for themselves. I got the wrong T-shirt.
First serve the truth? No, something like that.
First to know the nature of things.
Yeah, exactly. And knowing the nature of things is it's about truth, finding out what is going on.
Yeah.
It's nothing about action. It's nothing about doing things in the world, which I can absolutely understand is a worthy goal for universities. It might not be what you would define as a university motto now if you were starting a brand new university.
Well, I think you'd strap a bit on. First know the nature of things and do something with it.
Well, that's what I've always said.
Just do that.
Well, I mean...
or in Latin, et tu.
Well, Brian Smith, when he was first Vice-Chancellor, attempted to say, and there should be a second part that says, and then take action.
Did he copy me?
I'm sure he did.
Rip me off.
I'm sure he did. But there is that tension that many scientists would say, no, my taking action is the finding out the nature of things.
Yeah, and for some that's true, and that's fine. I'm not against it. I don't believe in this instrumental view that all research, science or otherwise, must serve a clear purpose in that sense. But a lot more of it could. It doesn't have to change much. You just got to add that last bit to it. You've got to add how do we use it? How do we do it? And a big part of it, as we both and all know in this realm, is tell the story more clearly, get it out, let people know, help them find out, or at least if there's a curiosity, can you find a way to help fuel or feed that curiosity in a way that's amenable to the curious?
Yeah.
Not ram it down people's throats, but I'm not against persuasion. I got no problem persuading people to change for climate or COVID, whatever. And if I'm seen as manipulative, honestly, I don't care, because the greater goal right now is, not having old people dying and people having chronic diseases for the rest of their lives because they've got some weird virus. That to me is more important. That's my goals and my values.
Yeah.
Others may not feel that way because it's not totally true to the science. Good for them.
Tell me more about Stephen Colbert and why you feel that he, as a model of public intellectualism, is one that we in the world of science should follow.
Well, him, and honestly lately for me, more John Oliver.
Yeah.
Because John Oliver's show, if you just talk it through, and if you haven't seen John Oliver's show, try and download some stuff if you don't.
It's very hard to do.
Yeah. Okay, well the funny thing with him is, each episode has, as the core of the episode, a long story on a topic. And it could be, literally, tax reform in 1873, or what the prison systems look like.
But I just want
boring sounding garbage.
It's a story,
Yep.
but it's clearly fact-based.
Clearly fact-based.
So story does not equal not fact.
No, story is clearly fact-based. Yep. But then what he does is, he and Colbert does this too, they have extremely good fact-checkers and researchers, but then they put their own political angle on it. And the idea that in itself is evil and wrong is something I challenge. They're not pretending otherwise. So like when Jon Stewart used to get abused by right-wing people, they would look at them and say, "But mine's a comedy show.
Yeah.
You're portraying your garbage as news. I'm not. Mine's satire." The fact that
isn't he having it both ways there? He was telling news.
But again, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Like he's not. They even say at the top of the Daily Show, they used to. It's this is a new satire program. The stories haven't been fact checked. Yeah. That in itself is a bit tongue in cheek too. But the bottom line is they're encouraging you to challenge, spin things around, and humour does that.
Yeah.
Which is why I think someone like Colbert or John Oliver or Jon Stewart and indeed Amy Schumer did it with some sexual politics stuff when she was doing comedy. You bring up controversial, difficult, topical things that do have fact base to them, and you can go away and look up all the facts and all the details from many different perspectives. But they serve it up in a way that's well digested. It's entertaining and worth watching. I've never been so fascinated by some of the most boring topics in the world as I watch John Oliver, because he delivers a bunch of facts and he throws into some ridiculous aside that's relevant and hilarious. It can be wrong, it can be completely unexpected, and it keeps me there. So that's why I'd call them public intellectuals. They're definitely taking a stand. They're definitely disrupting the thinking. They're definitely also, though, they're evidence-based, they're research-based, and when they're wrong, they say so. At least so it would appear from their formats. They will later on say, 3 weeks ago we did a story on X, we got this bit entirely wrong. Here's what it should have been. Yeah. I don't see hardcore, boring, or right-wing, particularly people doing that. They double down.
These are all very American examples.
They are.
Are there Australian examples?
The Wholesome Show.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Yes, and
the other ones.
And the other. But, well, here's the thing.
I don't know.
I mean, okay, a couple of things. One is, are there good Australian or other country examples that you throw to? Or is this a thing that can only be done with a huge production team. You know, you imagine
Yeah.
The Daily Show, you know, they've got
Yeah.
a team of writers and they've worked on their tone, their standpoint and tone for at least 20 years.
And the raw research, like the capacity to churn through like crate loads of stuff.
Is this modern public intellectual only something that's possible in the American media industrial complex?
I don't think it's the only way. I think also the danger, like when Australians have tried it, there's Sean McAuliffe, when he hits it pretty well, but he's hit and miss, but he does an Australian version of satire that is highly evidence-based at times. Dan Illick, I think, and some of their shows, and I can't remember the recent one that just folded on the ABC, they have a crack. John Clark and Stephen Dawes, before John Clark died, they would do these quick snippets at the end of current affairs programs. They were political satire, but they were based on facts. They were delivered in controversial, amusing ways.
I think they did really well.
Possible.
They were very contained.
They were very contained.
Not just in the 5 minutes, but you almost couldn't imagine them then writing an opinion piece or for
I don't know. I don't know. But I don't think you need to. Like, I mean, public intellectualism can just be the comedic output as well. I don't think it needs to then convert to the written word or whatever necessarily.
Yeah, I don't know.
I think it's horses for courses.
This is your definition, of course. I'm just trying to. I'm trying to understand how, because you could imagine a Jon Stewart or someone like that going from we do our day job, which is the comedic bit. But if I was then to stand up on the soapbox or the street or the city hall and declare something, it's not unbefitting of his character. It works.
No, it's not. And I think maybe there is something more uniquely American about it too. Maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
I think part of the problem in it translating to Australian context is perhaps I feel like there's still an awkwardness quite often to the way Australians deliver it. And maybe part of the problem is even implicitly trying to mimic the formulas that they see from particularly the US. Russell Howarth, UK comedian, does a pretty good job. Non-American example. He does a stand-up show where he uses snippets of news and he uses them hilariously. But he also does some shows where he kind of does ethnographies, almost cultural experiences with his mum in America and stuff like this. Or he'll do short-form interviews with all kinds of different people: sports people, politicians, scientists, artists. Always with the comedic intent. Always him being the little shit, but well-informed, really quite funny. I feel like Australia hasn't quite found the Australian version of doing that.
Yeah, fair enough.
That's my feeling. I don't think it's impossible to do. Having a huge research crew would help.
Yeah, sure.
But I don't think it's the only way.
So I would say, you know, maybe in there something about the tone. Like it's
Definitely.
very hard to isolate precisely that tone.
Yeah.
What direction you're punching, the sorts of jokes that you do, obviously the sorts of research that you do, which stories you pick, all of those things in together. That it is a challenge to find that place to be that public intellectual.
Well, and that tension. So speaking of which, I mean, John Oliver is an American example, but he is 100% an English guy.
Yeah.
So part of his strength or his uniqueness is he's a POM who I think's become an American.
He's a citizen now, I think.
But he talks of himself regularly as I'm British. So he gets to be that kind of outsider, which is another part of that whole challenging the status quo public intellectual thing. The old version of being the idiot, which is the person who doesn't speak the language of the formal classes or whatever, and looks in from the outside and can point to things that those inside don't see.
Does this have a historical parallel all the way back to the jester, the idiot?
My understanding is it goes back like Aristotle and beyond. Like ancient Greece, I think idiot comes from ancient Greece.
Yeah.
That notion of the more formal version of idiot is not just a drongo, it's someone who is divorced and removed and therefore has some value in their commentary as well.
I've seen definitions of idiot saying has no understanding of politics. And two ways you can take that.
Yeah.
Two ways you can take that. One being they don't understand the political process. The other way, they can be be divorced to it. Like they understand it absolutely, probably more than anyone else. But they are not within the political structures. So they're a jester or something, and so they can say things that no one else can say because they're not beholden to all those networks and stuff like that. And so
the tradition of the comedian.
They can poke that thing that no one else.
Comedians can say things that would be outrageous in any other context. And I mean, for me, obviously it's very blokey humour, but you know, Family Guy, South Park, and things like that. They point the finger at some social phenomena. The things they say, if you took them out of context, are out bloody outrageous, but when you see them in context, you understand. And Jim Jeffries, Australian comedian who's moved to America, he does a kind of semi-current affairs-y kind of show. His claim to fame is an American. He did a spiel on gun laws and gun control in the US. Many people may have seen this, but if you haven't, look it up. He's crass as hell, he's super vulgar, but he's quite insightful, and he's taken the Australian view on America, and he plays it insanely. Like, he really plays up being an Aussie maniac. But it's very blokey humour. However, he can say things, and these other people say things in ways that no one else could. And he talks about this, where he was making jokes to do with, we'll call it sexual abuse without, or sexual behaviours without consent. And he was told, you can't make jokes about that. And then he was abused in the newspaper, and it was written down what he'd said. Yeah. And when you read it, it's a horror story. You read the lines that without context, without tone, without anything, it looks terrible. Then he repeats it the way he said it, and you go, of course, that makes sense. You might find it a bit shocking, but it has context, it has tone, it has intent, and you can feel it. Yeah. Very, very different. And so I think that's part of it too, like the comedians can do things in ways that no one else can, which is why I really admire them. But you've got to choose the right medium for it. You've got to have the timing and the context.
And obviously, plenty of comedians get it wrong these days.
Yeah.
And are dead. Like they're socially dead for stepping the wrong direction, and probably deservedly. Like there's certain jokes that they don't have a place anymore in our society. So I think they are walking that risk line. In a sense, what they're doing is saying, all right, I'll burn all other bridges, and this will be my bridge. Yeah. But then you get it wrong, and that's it. Right, there's the dog cue.
Also, though, some comedy's not for everyone.
No, of course.
And people, I think we've got to be careful of that. This whole idea of that person in that niche audience said this terrible thing. It's like, yeah, but they weren't talking to you. I know this can be, it depends on the topic and the potential for harm, but sometimes they're not talking to you, and don't watch, don't get involved. Yeah. And I think we need to be prepared to run with that line too a little bit in SciComm, particularly dealing with controversy and danger and so forth. Be aware that you can't reach every audience simultaneously in the same way. That's just realistic. So maybe you have to take a hit from that audience to reach that audience. Yeah. And I think that's tough but necessary.
I like it's so often, people, when they're asking for that, okay, what do we do as scientists to do this? So many people are looking for that silver bullet, and for them, that silver bullet is so often this beautifully written paragraph. It's that one paragraph that will do everything perfectly for everyone. And unless you're talking about, okay, there's a fire in the building, and that paragraph is run.
Get out.
And anything with any more level of complexity, you're going to need to talk to people differently. Yeah. And in fact, fire, there's going to be things you need to do. But
we accept that too. Like this is the thing. I think the myth is we don't challenge the idea that it's a mistake. It's a problem if you haven't achieved that. Yeah. I've crafted this communication that will work perfectly for X% of an audience. Maybe that's enough. Just be clear that it's for that kind of audience. I think that's fine. And for that kind of audience, maybe you're not the right person, or you haven't got the right posse to handle it, or the right research. That's okay though. That we shouldn't let that remain implicit. That you failed if you haven't reached everyone. That should be made explicit. Say, well, tell me why it's a failure. You didn't reach everyone. Guilty, Your Honour.
Indeed.
I didn't reach everyone. You're right. Yeah. Lock me up. So that could be used as an excuse for horrible behaviour too, and I'm aware of that. But
all right, last question. Given that it's COVID right now,
is it?
Yeah.
Isn't that over?
Yes and no.
Thank God.
Tell me one thing that that you wish the lead communicators, scientists and public health officials and potentially politicians are not doing that you wish that they were doing.
To do with COVID? I mean,
in this current crisis-y situation.
Honestly, in general, the one thing I'd like to see happen is not specific to COVID, but it would help. It's when someone in a leadership position gets it wrong, they go, I fucked it up. I got this wrong. Here's what was wrong. Here's why, and here's what I'm going to do about it. I'd love to see more of that in leadership positions. Actually own a mistake. Because the idea that you've exposed weakness and therefore you're not worthy of following, etc., because you've made a mistake and admitted it is insane. Yeah. Like it's nuts to think that way.
It's almost like showing that weakness will lead to more authenticity and might make you more likely to connect with people in the future, and that's useful for your tone.
Yeah, people make oopses, even our prime ministers. Just own the mistake and then say what you're going to do about it. Like that. That's it for me. Just own stuff.
Own it. All right.
So simple.
Thank you.